The story of the Soviet Union is one of the most sprawling, transformative, and devastating epics in human history. It is a narrative born in the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of the First World War and ended by a quiet bureaucratic decree on a cold December night. In the 74 years that lay between, this vast empire reshaped global politics, industrialized a continent at breakneck speed, defeated the war machine of Nazi Germany, and stood as one of the world's two nuclear superpowers. It was an experiment that promised a utopian future for the working class, yet frequently paved its path with immense human suffering, rigid authoritarian control, and structural inefficiencies that ultimately triggered its dramatic collapse. To understand the modern world, we must understand the rise, the reign, and the fall of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. To find the roots of this superpower, we must look to the twilight of the Romanov dynasty. By the year 1917, the Russian Empire was fracturing under the catastrophic weight of the First World War. Millions of Russian soldiers had been slaughtered, the domestic economy was in ruins, and bread shortages plagued the capital city of Petrograd. The centuries-old autocracy of Tsar Nicholas II collapsed in March of that year during the February Revolution, replaced by a fragile, provisional government. But this new government made the fateful decision to stay in the war, failing to address the population's desperate cry for peace, land, and bread. Watching from exile in Switzerland was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to the world as Vladimir Lenin. He was the brilliant, fiercely disciplined leader of the Bolsheviks, a radical faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. Recognizing that the provisional government was incredibly weak, Lenin returned to Russia in April. He electrified the working class and revolutionary soldiers by demanding all power be transferred to the Soviets, which were local workers' councils. Beside him stood Leon Trotsky, a master strategist and orator who would soon build the revolutionary military force. By late autumn, the crisis reached a boiling point. On the night of November 6th and 7th, 1917, according to the modern calendar, the Bolsheviks struck. Red Guards and revolutionary sailors seized key bridges, telegraph offices, and government buildings across Petrograd. They stormed the Winter Palace, arresting the remaining ministers of the provisional government. This was the October Revolution. It was a remarkably swift coup that permanently shattered the old order and established the world's first self-proclaimed socialist state. Winning power, however, was only the beginning. The Bolsheviks immediately pulled Russia out of the First World War by signing the deeply humiliating Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918, surrendering vast amounts of territory to Germany. This move, combined with the total overthrow of the wealthy classes, plunged the nation into a savage civil war. For 3 agonizing years, the Red Army, organized by Trotsky, battled the White Army, a loose coalition of monarchists, capitalists, and moderate socialists backed by foreign intervention, including troops from Britain, France, and the United States. This was a total war fought with merciless brutality on both sides. To survive, Lenin instituted a policy known as war communism. The state nationalized all industries, banned private enterprise, and forcibly requisitioned grain from the peasantry to feed the cities and the army. To crush domestic dissent and eliminate political enemies, the Bolsheviks unleashed the Red Terror, utilizing a newly formed secret police force known as the Cheka. By 1921, the Red Army had emerged victorious, but the victory was hollow. The country was completely ruined, suffering from a horrific famine that claimed millions of lives and facing widespread peasant uprisings against grain seizures. Realizing that the nation was on the brink of total collapse, Lenin made a tactical retreat. In March of 1921, he introduced the new economic policy. This policy temporarily reintroduced elements of capitalism into the economy. While the state retained control of the commanding heights of industry, banking, and foreign trade, small-scale private businesses were allowed to reopen, and peasants could sell their surplus grain on an open market. The economy began to recover rapidly. With stability returning, the Bolsheviks formally consolidated their territory. On December 30th, 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially established, uniting Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian republics into a single federation. Lenin's health was failing rapidly, accelerated by an assassination attempt years earlier. He suffered a series of strokes that left him paralyzed and unable to speak before finally passing away in January of 1924. His death sparked a fierce, behind-the-scenes power struggle for the future of the Soviet state. On one side was Leon Trotsky, who advocated for a permanent global revolution. On the other side was a quiet, master bureaucrat from Georgia who had spent years consolidating power as the General Secretary of the Communist Party. His name was Joseph Stalin. Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals with ruthless political skill. He formed temporary alliances to isolate Trotsky, then turned on his allies once Trotsky was exiled from the country. By 1929, Stalin had achieved absolute dominance over the party and the state. He immediately abandoned the capitalistic compromises of the new economic policy and launched what historians call the Second Russian Revolution, a massive effort to modernize the Soviet Union through state terror and sheer willpower. Stalin famously declared that the Soviet Union was 50 to 100 years behind the advanced Western nations, and that they must close this gap in 10 years or be crushed. To achieve this, he introduced the first 5-year plan in 1928, focusing entirely on heavy industry. Giant factories, massive steel mills, and massive hydroelectric dams were constructed across the country, often built from scratch in the wilderness by hundreds of thousands of workers. To pay for this industrialization and feed the growing urban workforce, Stalin ordered the forced collectivization of agriculture. Millions of independent peasant farms were liquidated, and their land, livestock, and equipment were integrated into giant, state-run collective farms. The wealthier peasants, known as kulaks, resisted fiercely, burning their crops and slaughtering their animals rather than surrendering them to the state. Stalin responded with total war. Millions of kulaks were executed, imprisoned, or deported to remote regions of Siberia. The disruption caused by forced collectivization, combined with unrealistic grain quotas demanded by the state, resulted in a catastrophic man-made famine between 1932 and 1933. The hardest-hit region was Ukraine, where millions of men, women, and children starved to death in a tragedy known as the Holodomor. The state sealed borders and continued to export grain abroad to buy industrial machinery while its own citizens perished by the millions. By the mid-1930s, Stalin's paranoia grew alongside his absolute power. He suspected conspiracies everywhere within the military, the government, and the party itself. This culminated in the Great Purge, which peaked between 1936 and 1938. A series of highly publicized show trials were staged in Moscow, where old Bolshevik heroes who had fought alongside Lenin were forced to confess to absurd charges of treason and espionage before being executed. The purge quickly spread throughout society. The secret police, now known as the NKVD, operated under strict quotas for arrests and executions. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and colleagues denounced colleagues to save themselves. Hundreds of thousands of engineers, scientists, intellectuals, and military officers were shot in dark basements or sent to the Gulag, a vast network of forced labor camps stretching across the frozen wilderness of Siberia and the Soviet Far East. By the time the terror subsided, Stalin had systematically eliminated any potential opposition, leaving the Soviet population completely traumatized and utterly obedient. As the shadow of the 1930s lengthened, the threat of an aggressive Nazi Germany loomed large on the Western horizon. Stalin recognized that the Western democracies were hesitant to form a true military alliance with the Soviet Union. In a shocking geopolitical move that stunned the world, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany on August 23, 1939. This agreement, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, contained a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into Nazi and Soviet spheres of influence. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, triggering the Second World War, the Soviet Union moved swiftly to claim its share of the spoils. 2 weeks later, Soviet forces invaded eastern Poland. Within a year, the USSR forcibly annexed the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and launched a brutal winter war against Finland to push the border further away from Leningrad. Stalin believed he had bought precious time to prepare his military for an inevitable conflict with Adolf Hitler. That illusion shattered on the morning of June 22, 1941. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive, surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, involving over 3 million Axis soldiers. The German war machine tore through Soviet defenses, catching the Red Army completely unprepared due to Stalin's stubborn refusal to believe intelligence warnings. Within months, millions of Soviet soldiers were captured or killed, and German forces were advancing rapidly toward Leningrad, Moscow, and the vital oil fields of the Caucasus. The Soviet Union faced total annihilation. Leningrad was cut off from the world, beginning an agonizing 900-day siege where over 1 million civilians died of starvation and bombardment. By December of 1941, German vanguard units could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. In this darkest hour, the Soviet people rallied. Stalin remained in Moscow, transforming the conflict into the Great Patriotic War, a fight for national survival rather than communist ideology. A massive counter-offensive led by General Georgy Zhukov, aided by a brutal Russian winter, successfully pushed the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. The true turning point of the entire Second World War came in the winter of 1942 and 1943 in the ruined city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. For months, Soviet and German forces engaged in ferocious house-to-house urban combat. In November of 1942, the Red Army launched a brilliant pincer movement that surrounded and trapped the entire German Sixth Army inside the city. The German surrender at Stalingrad in February of 1943 broke the back of the German military and turned the tide of the war permanently. From that point on, the Soviet war machine was an unstoppable juggernaut. Following the massive tank battle at Kursk in July of 1943, the Red Army launched a series of massive offensives that liberated Soviet territory and drove the German forces entirely out of Eastern Europe. By April of 1945, Soviet troops had surrounded Berlin. On April 30th, Soviet soldiers hoisted the red hammer and sickle flag over the Reichstag building. The cost of this victory was staggering. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million citizens, including both soldiers and civilians. Entire cities lay in ruins. Thousands of villages were wiped off the map, and the country's infrastructure was completely devastated. Yet, out of this immense trauma, the Soviet Union emerged as an undisputed global superpower, occupying all of Eastern Europe and commanding the largest land army on Earth. The end of the war did not bring peace, but rather the dawn of the Cold War. As Europe was divided by what Winston Churchill famously called an Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union installed puppet communist regimes across Eastern Europe, creating a defensive buffer zone that included Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. In 1949, the geopolitical balance shifted dramatically when the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb, breaking the American nuclear monopoly. The world was now locked in a tense, bipolar confrontation that played out through proxy wars, espionage, and an escalating arms race. Domestically, Stalin returned to his old methods of absolute control, launching new purges and cultural crackdowns. But this dark era came to a sudden halt on March 5, 1953, when Joseph Stalin died following a stroke. His death threw the Soviet leadership into chaos, but it also opened a door for desperate reform. After another intense internal power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the new leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was a loud, unpredictable, and charismatic figure who recognized that the absolute terror of the Stalin years was unsustainable. In February of 1956, during the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev delivered his famous secret speech. In it, he shocked the delegates by directly denouncing Stalin's crimes, his cult of personality, and his use of mass terror against fellow party members. This initiated a period known as the Khrushchev Thaw. Thousands of political prisoners were released from the Gulag, censorship was significantly relaxed, and a cultural opening allowed citizens to speak more freely than they had in decades. Khrushchev also shifted economic priorities toward housing construction and consumer goods, promising that Soviet citizens would soon enjoy a standard of living that surpassed the capitalist West. This era was also marked by spectacular Soviet triumphs in the space race. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union stunned the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. 4 years later, on April 12, 1961, a young Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to travel into space. These achievements were paraded as definitive proof that Soviet socialism was technologically superior to Western capitalism. However, Khrushchev's foreign policy was erratic and highly dangerous. Seeking to counter American nuclear superiority, he secretly shipped nuclear missiles to the communist island of Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, bringing the world to the very brink of thermonuclear war before Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. This public retreat, combined with his chaotic agricultural reforms that led to unexpected grain shortages, alienated the party leadership. In October of 1964, Khrushchev was quietly removed from power while on vacation, becoming the only Soviet leader to be peacefully ousted. Khrushchev was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who would rule the Soviet Union for the next 18 years. Brezhnev represented the conservative party bureaucracy, which craved stability above all else. He halted the reforms of the Thaw, restored Stalin's historical reputation, and tightened ideological control over cultural life. Internationally, Brezhnev established a policy of military intervention to preserve communist rule, famously demonstrated when Warsaw Pact tanks crushed the Prague Spring liberalization movement in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Under Brezhnev, the Soviet military achieved full nuclear parity with the United States. This strength allowed for a period of international détente during the 1970s, marked by arms control treaties and a famous joint space mission with America. However, beneath this superpower facade, the Soviet system was beginning to rot from within. This period became known as the era of stagnation. The central flaw lay in the command economy. Every single economic decision, from the number of shoes produced to the price of a loaf of bread across 11 time zones, was determined by a centralized bureaucracy in Moscow. This system was excellent at building heavy industry and military equipment, but it was completely incapable of managing a complex, modern, consumer economy. Innovation stifled, corruption became rampant, and a vast black market emerged to fill the gaps left by state inefficiency. Soviet citizens spent billions of collective hours waiting in long lines for basic consumer goods, meat, and clothing. The state tried to mask these systemic structural failures by exporting vast amounts of oil and natural gas, which had been discovered in Siberia during the 1960s. When global oil prices were high, the Soviet government could easily afford to import foreign grain to feed its population and maintain its massive military expenditures. But this created a dangerous dependence on global commodity markets. The terminal decline of the Soviet Union began with two critical events at the turn of the decade. In December of 1979, the Soviet military invaded Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government. The conflict quickly turned into a bloody, unwinnable guerrilla war against Western-backed Mujahideen fighters. This intervention destroyed détente, drained the Soviet treasury, and cost the lives of thousands of young Soviet soldiers, severely damaging the government's credibility at home. Then, in the early 1980s, global oil prices collapsed, plunging the Soviet economy into a severe financial crisis. When Brezhnev died in 1982, he left behind a leadership structure that was essentially a gerontocracy, a government run entirely by elderly men. His two immediate successors, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, were both old and terminally ill, each dying after only a short time in office. The country was drifting, paralyzed by a total lack of direction. In March of 1985, the Communist Party realized it needed a completely new approach. They selected Mikhail Gorbachev as the General Secretary. At 54 years old, Gorbachev was dynamic, energetic, and highly educated. He belonged to a generation that had not participated in Stalin's purges, and he honestly believed that the Soviet system could be revitalized and made democratic without losing its socialist core. Gorbachev introduced two transformative slogans to the Soviet vocabulary: perestroika, meaning restructuring, and glasnost, meaning openness. Perestroika aimed to modernize the economy by introducing decentralization, allowing small-scale private cooperatives, and giving state enterprises more independence. Glasnost dismantled decades of state censorship, allowing the press to investigate government corruption, historical crimes, and contemporary social problems. The new policy of openness was put to a catastrophic test on April 26, 1986, when a reactor exploded at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. The local authorities initially tried to cover up the disaster, exposing millions of people to radioactive fallout before Gorbachev fully grasped the scale of the emergency. This catastrophe exposed the deep incompetence of the state bureaucracy and reinforced Gorbachev's belief that total transparency was absolutely necessary. Rather than saving the Soviet Union, Gorbachev's reforms inadvertently broke the bonds that held it together. Glasnost unleashed a tidal wave of suppressed information. For the first time, Soviet citizens could openly read about the horrors of Stalin's purges, the realities of Western prosperity, and the ongoing disaster in Afghanistan. The fear that had sustained the totalitarian state for decades vanished almost overnight. By 1989, the Soviet Union was losing its grip on its empire. Gorbachev made it clear that he would not use military force to prop up failing communist regimes in Eastern Europe. This triggered a chain reaction. Across the bloc, peaceful revolutions overthrew communist governments, culminating in the historic fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989. Inside the Soviet Union itself, long-suppressed ethnic nationalisms erupted. The Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Lithuania led the charge, demanding total independence from Moscow. Ethnic violence broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan, while the massive Russian Republic itself found a new leader in Boris Yeltsin, a populist reformer who openly challenged Gorbachev's authority from the democratic left. By 1991, Gorbachev was caught in a desperate political vice. He was constantly attacked by democratic reformers who felt his changes were too slow, and simultaneously threatened by hardline communist conservatives who believed his reforms were destroying the empire. In an effort to save the Federation, Gorbachev drafted a new treaty that would grant immense autonomy to the individual republics. To stop this treaty from taking effect, a group of hardline communist officials, including the head of the KGB and the defense minister, launched a desperate coup on August 19, 1991. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in the Crimea and sent tanks into the streets of Moscow. But the coup leaders failed to anticipate the fierce resistance of the public. Thousands of ordinary citizens flooded the streets to defend their new freedoms. Boris Yeltsin famously climbed onto a tank outside the Russian parliament building, defying the coup plotters and rallying the military to stand down. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed in total failure. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but he was now a leader without a state. The real power had shifted decisively to Boris Yeltsin and the leaders of the individual republics. The Communist Party, which had ruled the nation with an iron fist for over 7 decades, was promptly banned across Russia for its role in the coup. The final act played out quickly over the autumn months. One by one, the Soviet republics declared their independence. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly in a nature reserve and signed the Belavezha Accords, declaring that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist as a subject of international law. On the night of December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev delivered a televised address to the nation, formally resigning as the president of a country that no longer existed. At 7:32 in the evening, the red hammer and sickle flag was slowly lowered from the Kremlin flagpole for the very last time, replaced by the white, blue, and red tricolor flag of the Russian Federation. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially dead. The legacy of the Soviet Union remains one of the most deeply contested and complex chapters of modern history. For some, it stands as a monumental cautionary tale of the dangers of utopian engineering, a regime that sacrificed millions of human lives on the altar of an unachievable political ideology. For others, it is remembered as an era of profound industrial achievement, space exploration, and social stability that saved the world from the horrors of fascism. Its sudden collapse reshaped global geography, ended the bipolar confrontation of the Cold War, and left behind a complex geopolitical inheritance that continues to shape global conflicts and alliances to this very day. That is the history of the Soviet Union. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit like, subscribe, and comrades. I'll see you in the next video.